I found out there was more in this passage than I thought there was. In essence, I could have made 3 sermons out of this one passage, covering different topics that it covers. Anyway, Colossians was written by Paul, and it was meant to combat the false teachings of the Gnostics. They were always trying to add information. The apostles weren't good enough. We're better than them because we've got this special knowledge. We've got these trade secrets that the apostles left out. Jesus never told them, he told us. And it was like, time out. If it didn't come from Jesus, why am I paying attention to it? Along with John 1 and Hebrews 1, Colossians 1 provides the best exposition on the deity of Christ. What is deity? When you think of something as being a deity, what do you think of? It's holy and high, yes, I like that one. Holy and high, okay. The title of this section, incidentally, Sharon, the titles are not inspired scripture. They're footnotes, if you will, to the translators to break the different topics and ideas apart. So this one, my Bible reads, the supremacy of the Son of God. The NIV uses supremacy. The ESV uses preeminence. What's preeminence? Greater than. They mean the same thing. But I kind of like preeminence because sometimes we've watered down supremacy. We've got supercars, super batter for making cakes, super ice cream, things of that nature. But I've never heard anything called preeminent. So to me, that kind of just tells us more about what this passage is really going to be about. The idea is that Christ is the supreme being above all, and God, in particular Jesus, is over everything. So whatever we see in the world, whatever goes on in our lives, it's always controlled and overseen by God. Verse 15 at the beginning. The Son is the image of the invisible God. What's an image? What do you think of when you say an image? Presentation, okay. A picture, a painting, a statue. Those are all things that are images. Incidentally, in the 10 Commandments, there's one of them that says graven images. We should avoid them. If you wanted a complete read on that, I think it's J.I. Packer in Desiring God has a very good explanation. I'm sorry, he's not desiring, but it's J.I. Packer. Anyhow. Image is, in this regard, the Son is the visible image of the invisible God. But image doesn't necessarily just have to mean picture or portrait. The image also conveys the idea of representation. Adam was God's first representative. He was to take care of the garden. He was made in God's image. Okay. God then sent his Son to care for his interest, which is us. In particular, at that point in time, it was the Jewish nation, but it extended to the Gentiles. And to reveal his heart of love for mankind. In Colossians 3:10, we are renewed in the knowledge, in the image of the Creator. Who's the Creator? God, Jesus in particular. The rest of verse 15. The firstborn over all creation, or over every created being. Some people, both early and late, I mean, back at the time of Jesus and even currently now, take this to mean that the Son, Jesus, was the first thing that God created. But part of the problem is in the wording of the various translations. The NIV says overall creation. The NASB and the New American Standard say of all creation. The King James, however, says of every creature. And the Geneva Bible, which is the one just before the King James, was the first begotten of every creature. So the early people, when they read this, took it to mean he was the first one who was created by God. So Jesus wasn't part of God. God was just number one. I mean, Jesus was just number one. And we'll come back to that in another verse. Oops, excuse me. Firstborn has three possible meanings. Literally, we can take it as Luke 2:7. Jesus was Mary's firstborn. All of us that have kids understand what the term firstborn means in that sense. That's the literal sense. In the figurative sense, Exodus 4:22 says, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. This gives the idea of a distinctive place in his plans and purposes. As Roger mentioned, I'm beeping again. I lost my train of thought. The salvation comes from the Jews. So that was God's purpose for them. They were supposed to spread the good news. Instead, they took another path and didn't quite do what they were supposed to. Not until Jesus came and straightened them back out. The third possible definition is it's a place of superiority, primacy, uniqueness. In Psalms 89:27, we read, and I will appoint him to be my firstborn. That was speaking of David, the king that God appointed. Paul is saying Christ is earlier than them and preeminent over him. So any one of those things, over Adam, over David, over the nation of Israel, Jesus was before them, and he is higher ranking than any of them. Verse 16, for in him all things were created. Who's the him? Christ. So this verse refutes the idea that Jesus was the first created being of God, because he was the creator. He created all things, therefore he could not be created. And if he was going to be the creator, he had to be there before the creation. You can't very well make something that you can't make yourself and then make something of yourself, at least not in the sense that the Bible's talking. The rest of verse 16 is things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. All things were created. It shows his power. He was the architect. Through him, he was the agent. He was the person of the Trinity through whom the creative act was performed. Jesus made everything. Or God in the persona of Jesus made everything. Created for him. For him all things were created. He was the goal of creation. Visible and invisible. We understand visible in the sense of, especially right now, we've had elections. There are changeovers in different countries of who the leader is and who the leader is going to be. So we understand this concept of having a, if you will, chain of command, chain of government working its way up. We have powers, we have dominions, we have kings. We see all of them. But what's invisible? What is the invisible part that he sees? Heaven. In Ephesians 3:10 we read, so that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. The angels in heaven have different jobs. They have a hierarchy in heaven. We all know of, certain angels, Michael and whatnot, that are kind of special. They're mentioned. If you read the book of Enoch, you find out the names of all 7 of them that they claim are the hierarchy of the angels. But there are other jobs that angels do. So one of them is thrones. They sit on thrones as rulers. And we see this in Revelations 2 and 3 when Jesus is addressing the churches. He addresses the angel who is over and then names the church. They have powers. There are angelic monarchs. They have power over certain things, certain assigned tasks that they are responsible for. Rulers and authorities. It points to the domains and kingdoms over which the heavenly beings reign. There are many places in the Bible where we see the angel came, the angel of, the different churches, the different people, nations were guided by angels. So that's one of the tasks that they serve. And in verse 17 he says he holds all things together. Jesus controls everything. The stars, the planets, the weather, the rulers, everything. Even while he was on earth, he controlled it. And all that we see. When Jesus was on the cross dying, he controlled the movements of the planets and the stars at the same time. Kind of explains some of the miracles he did. If you own something, you can walk on it. Jesus walked on water. Jesus quieted the storm because he had complete control over everything. Verse 18. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. He is the head of the church. Ephesians 1:22 and 23 read, and God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be the head over everything for the church, which is his body. So we find out the church is his body. The term here, church, comes from the Greek, and I am not going to make any attempt to pronounce it. I've got the word written down if anybody knows Greek, but anyhow. And it really means an assembly or gathering. There were any number of things. When the mob met in the middle of the street to crucify Jesus, believe it or not, that was a church. It was an assembly of being with a common goal. But that's how the word has evolved into is church as we know it. There's 2 ways we use the term church. We have the universal church. That's everybody. It's past, present, one denomination, different denomination. It doesn't matter. It's followers of Christ. It's all believers. The local church is an assembly of believers who meet in a place and time to worship. We worship today. We're here. We're a small group, but we're here. Matthew 18:20 says, "For where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am among them." That's not just a promise of his presence. It's also a definition of what a church is. Two or more is enough. You don't need big congregations. You don't need everything, all these other things that some churches have. You don't need, we call this building a church, but it's not. It's just a building that's used for churchly purposes, worship purposes. It's not a church in the definition of the Bible. One of the things we find, though, in a church, what's the requirements? If you have to have two or more people, it's a gathering. Why? The church was designed by God to allow us to continue to experience his presence in a real and powerful way. Hebrews 10:20-25, somewhat condensed. Let us approach with a true heart the full assurance of faith, not abandoning our meeting together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging each other, and so much more as we see the day drawing near. The day he's referring to here is the end of time, the return of Christ. But it says that we meet together. It's nice in today's technology that we have the video machines and things of that nature for the people who can't make it. That's great that they can. But if you can make it, you should be here. Why? We have to take into account that part of the purpose of this meeting, if you will, is to give hugs. It's to show support. It's to show caring. It's to request help. It's a shoulder to cry on. So that's all the purposes of a church. It's not just some holier-than-thou gathering. It has a specific purpose. The speaking is, if you will, one of the minor parts. It turned in the modern church, we kind of want to hear the pastor's sermon. We think that's the greatest thing in the world. But that was not the original purpose of a church. What did the early churches do? They met in the morning before work for prayer. They shared in common bread and wine. We call it communion. So each of those are things that the church should and could be doing. You have to think back in COVID. What was one of the first things they took away? Public gathering. Why? Well, they claimed it was for this control the spread of the disease, but it was also a tactic, if you will, it's a tactic of Satan. How can I break the churches apart? If they can't meet together, we break that bond they have with each other. We notice that in the fact, and that's not just here, it's all churches. They haven't recovered yet. They haven't recognized that there's a purpose for this meeting between people of like mind, especially as it associates with Christ. We're supposed to be here to worship Jesus, to worship God, and to love one another. Excuse me. Okay, verses 19 and 20. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. I want you to notice that the phrase under the earth is not present. What I mean by that is most things, when you read these lists off of things in heaven, things on earth, and things under the earth, this one does not have this particular set, does not have the phrase under the earth. Because there are some things that cannot be reconciled. fallen angels, Satan. Reconciled means to restore to right relationship, and some things evidently cannot be reconciled to God. Jesus is preeminent because all the fullness of God dwells in him. Always dwells. It's not temporary. Jesus didn't get the Spirit when he was baptized and then lose it just before the crucifixion. He had it before that. He had it after that. It was always with him. And it was always in him. The second reason is his death reconciled the universe to God. The entire universe was affected by Adam's sin. Certain angels sinned, but not reconciled. Jude 6 tells us, and the angels who have been kept in their position, who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting change for judgment on the great day. Animals were affected. Romans 8:22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. The ground was cursed. Genesis 3:17 tells us, cursed is the ground because you. Through pain, toil, you will eat from it all the days of your life. The stars were not pure. Job 25:5 reads, if even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes. Heaven needs to be purified. Hebrews 9:23 reads, it was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. But the heavenly things themselves were better sacrificed than these. We don't know what that means, in all honesty. One of the possibilities is that part of the reason heaven needs to be purified is because if we look in Job in chapters 1 and 2, God was with the angels when they went to see, Satan was with the angels when they went to see God and make his petition. Satan challenged Job to a battle, and God approved of it. So Satan was in the presence of God in his throne, on his throne. So some people think that that is what has to be purified. We have to have a new heaven, because the same way we need to have a new earth. When we get to the Revelation, things are new heaven and the new earth. We have to do that to get rid of the sin, the taint of sin from the old. In the rest of the chapter, Paul turns his attention to the actual people. Verse 21 and 22. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free of accusation. So we see here that we are reconciled by the blood in verse 20. And we are reconciled by the body in verse 22. I've frequently wondered in communion in my younger days, why was it always the body and the blood? We read the song, most of the songs sing about the blood of Jesus. They don't sing about the body. The death of the body was a critical part of reconciliation of sinful man to God. Think of the sacrifices that the Jewish nation used to make. Remember, that's the earthly picture of the heavenly event. The animals died. They spread the blood on the stone, on the altar, whatever. They had particular ceremonies they went to. But the donator of the blood had to die physically. As part of the reason why we know Jesus was a real person. He wasn't just some little persona. He was acting as a carrier for the essence of God. But he actually was God. He had to die physically to reconcile us to the Father. So between the body and the blood, we are reconciled to God if once we accept Jesus. Verse 23, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard, and that was proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. We look at that, and some people say, well, does that mean I can lose my salvation? It tells me if I continue in the faith. If I uncontinue in the faith, does that mean I'm no longer saved? Might mean it. Because the real point is, if you no longer follow it, you probably were never saved in the first place. The essence, or the measurement tool that the early church used for salvation was perseverance. How well did you persevere through trials and tribulation? When everything got going hard, when the soldiers invaded the church, did you run out the back door? Or did you stay, putting your trust in God? That was how they determined whether you were saved or not. If we read, again, if we read in Revelations when he's going through the churches, there's a challenge at the end of each one of those things. If you stay, if you persevere, if you hear. Incidentally, the term where it says in there, let him who has ears hear, let him who has eyes see, that is not a funny joke. That is an imperative. You will do this. If you see it, you're expected to follow it. If you hear it, you're expected to obey it. It's not a choice. That's what that phrase means at the end of each one of those little paragraphs. So it's not just a choice they can have, it's a demand by God on them. Your testimony was based on your faithfulness. So this verse is not referring to losing your salvation, but showing it daily. If you don't stay and remain faithful, you probably weren't saved in the first place. And at the end, Paul proclaims this is his mission, his life's goal, and what he has always taught. It's interesting, Paul was never at Colossae. He never visited it. He had nothing to do with it. It was just a church that he wrote to. It was another man, Erasmus, I think, not the one that's later on the writer, but he actually established a church in Colossae. And when Paul heard about it, he sent them a letter of encouragement because he knew of the battles that they had coming to them, and he explained to them some bad doctrine that was slowly creeping into the congregation. Last week, Roger covered what Jesus was to go through. Isaiah 53, suffering servant, my tongue's getting tight. And what was necessary to reconcile us to God. This week we celebrated communion, the body and the blood. Those are necessary elements for our reconciliation to God. This passage covered the deity of Christ and while he is able to open the scroll in Revelations chapter 5. He is a lamb that appeared slaughtered. And he he opened the scroll of God's judgment on the earth for those who no longer believe. Thank you.